Hello, everybody. Uh, it seems that David is having a little bit of a challenge. I suspect he went and opened the wrong email to get here, so he thinks that the show has ended. So, anyways, he should be here shortly. Here he comes. Oh, there. And there's our master techie.
Oh, look at me.
Yeah, you always want to check the date on the email.
Sorry, John. Sorry, yeah. It's not my thing. It's not my thing.
That's probably a good thing in this day and age.
Yeah.
It still leaves room for some upbuilding forces that aren't subnature technics in order
Well, I think the modern generation assume that even if you're not good at it, that you love it actually, but I don't. I'm sorry, I don't like it. Therefore, that compounds the problem. So I don't like it, and then I'm not good at it anyway. So.
Well, I guess that makes you a bit of a Luddite. For those that don't know, a Luddite is a sect that avoided all modern technologies. They longed for an earlier era, but those days are gone. You don't really have much choice. So, anyways, here we are on our latest episode of What is Truth? And this is episode 27, and today is January 31st, 2021. And I've given a lot, as I normally do, I give a lot of thought to what we might chat about, and then we end up talking about whatever we end up talking about. But nonetheless, I think that there's a point that I found pretty relevant for the challenges that people are going through as to the nature of the times in which we live in the epoch of the consciousness soul. And seeing as I continually am trying to frame things in a context whereby one might come to an understanding from some perspectives that are derived from the spiritual science of Rudolf Steiner. And actually, this morning I was confronted by an email from somebody that I have a lot of respect for, but he should probably refrain from attempting to talk about occultism, because it's John Rappaport, who is quite an important journalist when it comes to understanding what's going on in the world of medicine and all of that. But he says very bad things about occultism and groups it together into some kind of canard that's meant to just trap you in a limited range of possibilities determined by whatever system that you are adherent to. Not to say that there aren't such phenomena. There are. But that being said, to try and frame occultism in that way and substitute his version where he has this reverence for the realm of consciousness, so to speak, that kind of Advaita Vedanta perspective that all is, the one consciousness and all of that. That's well and good. That's a perspective. And that can bring you the answer to certain questions, but it will not give you access to solve other questions. And that's the whole point, or an important aspect of what I think we're trying to do here, is to try and show how multifaceted truth is, and that there's fundamentally 7 moods of soul and 12 fundamental philosophical viewpoints that Steiner points out, and he gives examples as representatives of these various viewpoints, and says that every one of the viewpoints, whether it be materialism, spiritism, monadism, whatever path you go down, and someday we'll devote an episode to that, because I think that would be interesting, seeing as how our friend here, the Reverend David, is so widely read. He's probably even read a few of these, what are now considered obscure people. With that being said, that there's 12 fundamental philosophical viewpoints that pertain to the 12 senses, and Rudolf Steiner delineates 12 senses. That's beyond the 5, that there's another 7 senses that include some things that we'll get into, as I said, in a future episode. But you could consider, for example, sense of balance as a sense, isn't it? But nobody ever talks about it. They talk about 5 senses, and that's not one of them. Anyways, he makes the point that all 12 philosophic views have valid points that they can make, and that there are certain questions that can be approached through that methodology. But that there's a 13th viewpoint, and that 13th viewpoint is the realm of Christ, and that Christ dwells beyond all 12 viewpoints. And in entering into what I call the Grail path, or Rudolf Steiner calls the Grail path, is that awakening whereby through one's conscious path of spiritual development, one comes to a relationship with the spiritual world, but out of a totally free human individuality, rather than something that's just bestowed on you from outside. It's something that it's coming from within and developing outward. And so that's the dilemma, because we're in the epoch of the consciousness soul since like 1414 AD. And that it's also called the spiritual soul. But if you think about it, you go, well, geez, people today, they don't seem that spiritual. Well, yeah, but there's a lot of underpinnings that have been developing, especially in the last couple hundred years, that is a movement, especially since 1899 with the ending of the Lesser Kali Yuga. So that there's this unfoldment happening. But in souls that only occupy themselves with the sense-bound, materialistic, abstract thinking, they don't develop, they don't continue their development beyond the age of around 27. And so it behooves an individual to take up a spiritual striving so that one can continually develop. Because Rudolf Steiner makes the point that in earlier epochs, further back you go, the more true it was, that the older a person was, the wiser they were. But that natural growth receded over the thousands of years, so that now it happens to be at around age 27. And if you don't grow beyond that point, then that's on you. And so it's interesting perspective and worth investigating. And so I think we could touch on some things related to that. First, I want to introduce my dear friend here, the Reverend David William Parry from merry old England, city of London, the city of merchants. Some other things too, but it is a mercantile adventure in the square mile. David's the author of several books. There's a Shakespearean study, The Grammar of Witchcraft. No, it's not a book on witchcraft. His inspired Shakespearean-esque poetry, Caliban's Redemption, We all know Caliban is a character out of Shakespeare. And then his major work, it's quite celebrated in academic circles, Mount Athos Inside Me, Essays on Religion, Swedenborg and the Arts, and that's edited by Daniela Irendust. And it's a remarkable work about the spiritual aspects that he receives as an inspiration from his journeys to Mount Athos, which is a sacred spot in the Greek Orthodox tradition. David himself is being a reverend and actually being a reverend in several different traditions. We didn't even get through all of them last time, but we don't have to do that today. We could do a special episode about that. As for myself, my first book is The Arcana of the Grail Angel, The Spiritual Science of the Holy Blood and of the Holy Grail, a study developed out of the work of Rudolf Steiner, the underground streams of esoteric Christianity which flowed from the Brotherhood of the Holy Grail, the Order of the Knights Templar, and the True Rosicrucian Order. And with a foreword by Douglas Gabriel of American Intelligence Media, 640 pages. And then the sequel to that is The Arcana of Light on the Path, Star Wisdom of the Tarot and Light on the Path, whereby I show the Kabbalistic relationship between the 22 Arcana of the Tarot and the 22 paths of the Tree of Life and the facets of the esoteric teachings. And both of books contain extensive diagrams laying out the cosmology. In fact, it covers the 12 senses that I've spoken of even. My books are available on eBay for me personally. If you're outside the US, you have to contact me either through private message on Facebook, or you could also contact me through my academia website, which is listed down below, either on Facebook or on YouTube. David's books are available on Amazon. And so there you have it. That's who we are in the world of letters. A couple of authors just jawing away. So how you doing there, David?
Well, my apologies to you and my apologies to our listeners. Yes, I'm a technophobe. I'm sorry I'm a technophobe. Reasonably well, John, although, as you know, I'm convening a weird and wonderful conference on the Nephilim anthropology later in the year. Unfortunately, it will have to be online because there's not a single venue apparently in this city of merchants. I'm trying to live that down every single month. In this city of merchants, no one will make a business commitment about a venue at the minute. I tried everything, including a couple of esoteric places like the Theosophical Society building. Even they won't do it. So we've been forced to go online. I suppose that's showing what a Luddite I really am. I've got to get used to these hybrid awful things because there's no other way we can do it this year. But we were attacked. We were attacked by a Jewish author who seems to know more about the conference than I do because he's criticizing an event that actually hasn't taken place yet and seems to know more about what the speakers are going to say than they do because they haven't sent me their abstracts yet. So, I mean, this wonderful act of clairvoyance is being escorted by personal abuse. I don't know who this guy thinks he is exactly, but there are such things as libel. Be careful. And you may be the other side of the ponds, but I have friends everywhere, he said threateningly. Apart from the fact one of the participants, the wonderful Ra Castaldo, who's a chum of mine, is an expert in Muay Thai, boxing, and the rest of it. So be very careful. All good stuff, I suppose. But welcome back to showbiz. Yes, I confess to everybody, I see this more as a showbiz event than I do a talking heads bash. For the simple reason it's meant to be a fundraiser for Valentine's Hall. when I was talking about it a couple months ago to people, I thought, do I want learned scholars? Tell me, Professor, what does the Babylonian text actually say here? Well, Professor, if we could, no, I mean, no one will attend. No one will attend. Therefore, what's the point of having a fundraiser? Will we have people like that at some point? Yes, not at the moment, because Valentine's Hall needs some funds. There we are. Spoke to my friends at the Congregational Federation recently. I feel very uplifted about that. May have more news about that in the future. You mentioned obscure references. Curiously, over the last couple of days, I've been reading a very obscure one. Michel de Gelderode, who I'm a huge admirer of. I mean, I am Arto. I know he was still alive when I was born. I know that. But I'm sorry, that's just chronology, okay? I am Arto, right? This guy was contemporary with Arto. He's much less well known, which is a shame. Artaud's the great French surreal actor, surreal dramatist. I mean, that wonderful book of his, The Theatre and Its Double, don't get me wrong, viewers, had nearly biblical status for me at one point. Actually, it might still do. The final word on modern theatre. I wish I'd bloody written it. So, but he had a more hidden contemporary called Michel de Gelderode, who was actually from Belgium. There we are. There's at least one famous guy from Belgium who was obsessed with the same sorts of things: expressionism, theatre, puppetry, the heights and depths of human experience, feelings of elation, feelings of religious redemption, which I think makes him quite unique, actually. Probably he covers that more than even Arto. So I was wondering how much I was going to write about him for my next book. And therefore, as obscure references go, I think that's an obscure reference. I would love a show with you, Mr. Barnwell, on obscure references. That would be one of the most fun things I would do this year. Right. Conscious evolution. That was another one. The minute you said we got to 27 and most people don't evolve, they don't get to evolve but 7 years old. I mean, do any of them ever evolve at all? Some of the oldest people I know are still children. So, is age to do with chronology? I mean, is spiritual age anything to do with physical age? And I don't mean that ridiculous new left-wing need to have all these brilliant children solving the world's affairs. Can't see it, sorry. I mean, there was something I posted a couple of days ago on Facebook. I can't remember the event offhand. In 1920, this 8-year-old kid challenged a group of grandmasters to games of chess at 12 grandmasters, and surprise, surprise, he lost every single game. Ha! Shows you, you jumped up little nobody. So, we've got to keep a balance in all these things. But the minute you said that, I was thinking of what Gurdjieff said about mechanical living. I hated some of the things he said years back, about mechanical religion. And I remember Ouspensky. I was always more on his side, the great Russian intellectual, the mathematician. I could see where he was coming from, more than this half dervish, half dervish Armenian. I go, what the hell are you talking about? But an interesting guy, and the fact that he thought you could have mechanical religion, I hated that. I still hate that. I hated that thought, but I can sort of see what he means. But, even that's optimistic. Are we responsible for our own evolution, our own maturation in Christ? Yes. Why is it news now? That was always the case. Bloody grow up, take some responsibility. I'll hand back to you after this. I'm thinking primarily of two people that contacted me on Facebook during the week. I said, Joe Biden is not my president, right? Of course he's not. I'm British. We don't have presidents, and he's an American, right? So that was the point of me saying that he's not my president, because we have someone called the Queen, you see, and that awful Boris Johnson. Why doesn't he just call an election and go? So that's been my week so far, John. I'll hand back to you when I have another sip of water. I hope that gets a conversation going.
Well, I'm still trying to figure out that every time a Brit mentions the Queen, their voice trills off into falsetto. I, there's something going on there. I think that's some subliminal characteristic. I think that they still feel humbled as much as they might be kind of a Grinch regarding the whole thing, but yet they still chant "God Save the Queen." So it is ironically a centerpiece of cohesiveness within the British idea, but largely because of the continuation of their identity from a previous period in which they were playing a much larger role in a visible sense than they do now. Now their role is maybe even larger, but it's clandestine, and so that people are unaware of how entangled they are regarding corporate activities and all that. But I don't want to get into talking all that stuff. That's no fun. What I'm interested in, though, because it does illuminate some of that, because Rudolf Steiner said if you just spend your life counting and keeping track of money and all of that, that he said that it's not that your brain creates your thinking. It's more on the morphology aspects in reincarnation and karma. It's your thinking that creates your future brain. And if all you do is spend all your time in materialistic thought, abstractions, and just counting your pennies, you're not really doing anything to build the future. And he says straight up, he says that you will reincarnate as an imbecile. So if you look at all these horrid elites and banksters that are out there doing just that, well, we get the great come around when they reincarnate, because we'll probably end up having to take care of them because they will be ill equipped to take care of themselves. So what goes around comes around, as they say here in the States. And I think that that's the quib that fits that situation. As far as I read that review by that guy, if you can call it that, I mean, it was basically a broadside blasting you. It's like, how unfair. Obviously, he has his pet uh, perspective, and you walked into his wheelhouse, and it's a subject that he considers himself to be a measure of authority. And hey, that's fine. Uh, Good for you. But that's a difficult subject, because if you just get into the word, uh, there were the translation, there were giants in the earth in those days in the Bible, right? Well, if you go back to the Hebrew original, that could mean a giant, but it could also mean somebody who was great and powerful. It doesn't necessarily mean they're big, but if you go into the studies of occult science, it becomes a very specific challenge, one I've spent a lot of time on. And that's why I kind of, when you ask me about my involvement, it's like I have a particular perspective that I live in regarding that particular biblical challenge or question. And it's really central to understanding the mysteries, especially in the West, because you have that. It gets into the whole idea of what we would call, what the Greeks would call, well, how do we approach this? You see that there's these beings that are like if you go back to further, even go back to the Epic of Gilgamesh. And in the Epic of Gilgamesh, it describes Gilgamesh as being half human and half divine. Okay. So that's like not a normal individual, right? And so he was a creator of civilization because he was half human and half divine. And he gets into the wrestling match with Enkidu, right? But Enkidu is like this hairy wild man, but he's just, he's just a kind of a primitive human being. He's not uh, half divine like Gilgamesh. But they end up wrestling, and they for days until they finally go, okay. Basically, they say, okay, it's a draw, and they become fast friends. And so you see in that there's a depiction of something that conceals a very deep occult mystery, because as I frequently get into discussing that the principles of initiation are based upon realities. And as I've mentioned many times, conversation that I had with the spokesman for the Hopi elders, Thomas Binyakia, I asked him quite a few questions regarding the teachings. Like I said, are the Hopi from Atlantis? He said, yes. He said, the other tribes came over through Alaska, like the Navajo, and we taught them to grow corn. But no, we came from Atlantis, and that specifically in the occult doctrine that the what are called Toltec branches, of which Hopi are a branch of the Toltec. And I asked him, so you're a branch of Toltecs, right? He said, yes. So it's amazing that from an absolutely independent source, absolutely independent tradition, it concurs with the indications given out by both Madame Blavatsky in The Secret Doctrine and by Rudolf Steiner in Occult Science and Outline and many other places. So in looking at that perspective, and then when I talked to him further, and he agreed that the Earth is the fourth world, meaning that there were three preceding states of pre-human existence. And we didn't become human until we came to Earth and received what we refer to as the ego, which is the I am that I am, like mentioned in the Bible, is that principle of the ego, right? But that in each of the three preceding stages, there were beings that didn't graduate, because each one of those was a human stage for angels, archangels, and archai. Okay, so that you have throughout history, there are beings that are retarded angels, archangels, or archai that intersperse into human evolution. And when you hear of these great titans, for example, that they're beings that are part human, part divine, like Gilgamesh, it's indicating that either an angel or even an archangel had incarnated into the human body. And so there you have the image of greatness. And when you get into the idea of the great ones or the Nephilim, I think that that's what's pointing at. And so it is, these days, everybody wants to make everything about flying saucers and everything like that because we live in a technocratic age. And so it's UFO guys. Yeah, that's what it is. And well, interdimensional, yeah, because archangels and angels and archai, even they all belong in another dimension, not in a physical body. But when you see that you have, for example, a Luciferic angel from the Earth existence previous to the physical Earth was called Old Moon. And it was the third stage in which the astral was incorporated into what would become the human being later on. But There were beings that were human. They were going through their fourth stage on our third stage. And those beings, we call them angels. But there are beings that didn't graduate, and we call those retarded angels. And so those are the Luciferic spirits. The host of Luciferic spirits is these retarded angels. And trying to typify and characterize them is difficult because that's like saying to somebody, what's a New Yorker like? When there's every variety, shape, form, and type. And likewise, in a host of beings, there are beings in every level of the spectrum, of all the way from wholesome to unwholesome, that can be involved in that milieu. Likewise with the archangelic realm in the preceding stage, which we call Old Sun. And then, of course, far more exalted is the Archai, the time spirits, and that would be Old Saturn evolution, the first stage. Now, I'm giving these pieces because I keep making reference to them. And so it helps if you have some fundamental concepts to understand what I might in the world be talking about. But in the current stage that we're at, Rudolf Steiner, as you all should know by now, was the editor of Goethe's scientific works at the beginning of his academic career, just as he was coming through his education. And he took a job in Weimar to be the editor of Goethe's scientific works on a recommendation of Schroer, Professor Schroer. And because Schroer was capable of dealing with it as a literary heritage, but he needed somebody to wrestle with the scientific work, and he wasn't a scientist, so he brought in Rudolf Steiner, which is really a remarkable thing, and especially the timing on the whole thing, because it was after his days in the coffee shops in Vienna with quite a luminary cast of characters. But in getting into the major work of Goethe is Goethe's Faust, of which here in America people are hardly aware of it at all. But there's a line in there that's very, very pertinent to the time in which we live. And I like the translation that was published in 1886 by Frank Claudy of this particular passage. It's Faust, a Tragedy by Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, the first part translated in the original meters by Frank Claudy. And it says he's responding to the character Wagner. And Faust says, of this impulse alone thou standest confessed. Oh, to attain the other, seek now never. Two souls, alas, dwell here within my breast. One from the other always strives to sever. The one in lusty joy seeks here its rest, to this fair world with all its organs clinging. The other rises from the dust with zest, to high ancestral spheres its pathway winging. Oh, are there spirits pure and fair, who float twixt heaven and earth on easy pinions. Descend ye then from out the golden air, and lead me hence to new and strange dominions. Yea, could I but a magic mantle own, that would to foreign lands convey me, not for the costliest robes that might array me would I exchange, not for a kingly throne. And so there you have the Faustian dilemma, which is very pertinent in that whole concept of two souls dwelling within my breast. And you see that characterized again in the letters on aesthetic education, that the correspondence between Goethe and Friedrich Schiller. And there's that whole idea that there's this dynamic happening, and that there's that which has the aspirational development going on, but there's something that's darkened in us that used to be a source of enlightenment and development, and that was the part that ceased to function in the same way as we entered into the age of the consciousness soul. So no, David, I don't agree. It's like just always been that way and blah, 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 blah. No, the whole basic premise of spiritual science is that evolution goes through stages of development, and different faculties arise to meet the challenge of the times. And that's why I always found it pretty comedic when I was creating a relational database of thousands of volumes of Mesopotamian and Egyptian studies, and trying to see these professors, these Egyptologists, wrestle with the concepts and trying to solve it as if they're dealing with a modern consciousness who just doesn't know English or German or whatever, and they don't have any scientific training, and so they're just kind of making stuff up to cover stuff that they don't understand, which is I think nothing could be more incorrect than coming from that vantage point. Granted, they're not all like that, but I don't know that they can grasp fully, because if we're in the consciousness soul age, it began in 1413. In the 2,160 year cycles of these ages, there's 12 in a complete cycle of 25,920 years, precession of the equinox. And but directly before ours was the intellectual soul. That's like ancient Rome. That was the time in which our Lord Christ was crucified. And then before that, you have the sentient soul, which is the Egypto-Chaldean period, in which it's dealing in picture language, and clairvoyance is far more developed back then. And as we entered towards the turning point of time in the incarnation of Christ, we descended to earth until finally, in the afterglow of the turning point of time in the 13th century, we kind of reached a bottom in which there wasn't anybody clairvoyant for a brief period of time, because we had to develop as individual beings, and now the future clairvoyance will stream from within outward, whereas before it was something that came to us. And you can see that even like in the Mesopotamian cuneiform tablets, that they refer to, reading the clay tablets, that he hears them all around him. It's like, did you hear what I just said? I mean, they refer to the experience of the tablets as something that's resounding all around them. Okay, so it's definitely a different vantage point, but kind of misses the eye of most students of cuneiform, I think. Anyways, I'm just going on and on here, David, but I hopefully have addressed at least some of the things that you brought up.
I'm really worried I'm going to turn into two comedy figures if I'm not careful: the Reverend Whipham or the Reverend Burnham. I mean, evil, all this evil everywhere. I'm trying to resist that sort of thrust. Referring back to the truth-seeking gentleman for one moment, there's a bit of the story he left out, that he actually approached us to speak in the Nephilim Anthropology Conference. And I said, "I'm sorry, I haven't heard of you, and our quota of speakers is full for this year. Why don't you join our number, and basically, since this is an ongoing project, we'll consider you for next year." I noticed that was missing. And also, when did free thinking ever involve libelous homophobia? That's not quite what I mean by free thinking, but there we are. No, I don't consider it a broadside. I mean, the showbiz hat of me is mildly amused, and it's not the first time for a showbiz event that these things have happened. I dare say it won't be the last. No, as I was going to say earlier, for me, this particular conference is a wonderful mixture of theatre, scholarship, investigative inquiry. I mean, what I'll be speaking about, I mean, I'm curating, so I won't be speaking much myself, but I'll only be speaking about the art and literature surrounding the Nephilim, because I don't really feel qualified. I did moral theology at university. I don't really feel qualified to speak about these recondite mysteries. Some of those panelists do, but I don't know what they're going to say yet. So how this guy can know it, I don't know. Clairvoyance or not. And also, I noticed he said we got funding from a French video game company. I bloody wish we did. We haven't got a bean to run together at the moment. And by the way, Metropolitan Community Church is a fully recognised church. Wash your mouth, sin boy. And we're doing our best to bring the gospel to unlikely places a lot of the time. Be ashamed. Doing what Calvin himself would have recommended. Gosh, where do I go from there? I didn't mean it's always been the case outside of our present dispensation. I tend to see things in the rather classical theologist view of particular dispensations. In our dispensation, yes, there are different categories and different configurations and different ways that all these factors fit together, but I still hold by the thought, I suspect, that people have to want to progress, no matter what the configurations on an astral, etheric, or social or cultural plane actually are. And what always distresses me so much about present company accepted, and certainly in the case of Dr. Steiner accepted, that most modern mystics and clairvoyants are always outside of the historical imagination. This will, one of the funniest things, God, you're going to hate this, John, or love it, I don't know yet. One of the funniest things I ever attended, it wasn't meant to be funny, by the way, was, we didn't do channeling over here until it was big in America, and nobody knew what they were talking about. Then this, I won't say the name, this big American channeler came over, and it was the most funny thing I've ever attended in my life. It was put on by the Theosophical Society. My love to the Theosophical Society, I'm not attacking, where basically this guy was reliving his life as an Egyptian priest ancient Egyptian priest during the first part of the show. And, everything was slow and reverent, and the scrolls are hidden under the Sphinx. And oh my God, isn't that amazing? And then there was this incredibly long intermission with me saying to everybody, my God, is there a part 2 to this? And then we all got called back in with him saying Om as loudly as he possibly could in case he'd lost his audience. And then he was channeling an Irish spirit from, I think it was the 1760s. Bejeebus, top of the morning to you, and all that sort of stuff. And he didn't seem to realize what he was channeling can only, because it's Europe, love. Work out your audience, it's Europe. He was actually using an Irish-American accent as opposed to an Irish accent, which of course everybody knew, much to their embarrassment. Maybe downstate New York, you wouldn't know that, but over here you did know that. So I came away delighted for all the wrong reasons, and promised never to go back. I mean, that's a different thing. But yeah, I mean, and I'm not saying there's nothing to channeling, and I'm not saying there's nothing to mediumship. What I am saying is, within a particular epoch, within a particular church, as Swedenborg would have said, you're looking at different measures and different configurations of the same problem, the same issue, the same ability, the same lack of ability, and so on. In terms of Faust, I'm afraid of Goethe. When a mind is that sophisticated, I'm like Blake. I'm never certain half of the time that I'm sure what he's on about. I noticed C.S. Lewis had the same problem. When Blake's talking about the marriage of heaven and hell, are we really sure we know what he means? Are we really, really, really sure? And I noticed when C.S. Lewis wrote his book, The Great Divorce, because a Christian can't possibly mean that, I noticed there's a very clear caveat at the beginning. No, I'm not entirely sure what William Blake meant, but so I think we've got to be a bit careful when we're dealing with these incredibly sophisticated minds. That said, and I'm a great, huge admirer of Goethe, and of course, as I said on a previous show, Schiller is another person on that sort of biblical level for me. The man that starts, even Hegel said that's a philosopher, from the ultimate boring old professor. I mean, that's a compliment. The guy devoting himself to poetry and drama and trying to make sense of it all and introducing those wonderful concepts like the play instinct, which actually was unknown in Europe at that particular time. Yes, it's not just a waste of time. Actually, all these complex things are going on and they're vital to human nature. So players and theatres aren't just idling away time. There's a lot more to it than that. My preferred version of Faust, curiously, is Christopher Marlowe's, not because I'm waving the flag. I think everybody knows me well enough now, and I know you do, John Bower, not to be one of life's great Union Jack wavers. But I found the lack of moral ambiguity. I've always, every time I read Faust by Goethe, I always get to the end thinking, but I'm meant to dislike you, and I'm not sure I do dislike you, because there are so many angelic qualities, and that's not the idea, surely. Yes, there are angelic qualities or a leftover angelic qualities, but not quite so many. Not quite so many. I find that a bit difficult. Therefore, I'm not sure I got the gist of it. If you look at Christopher Marlowe's, the elder contemporary of Shakespeare, I mean, they were all kids. When you say elder contemporary, it basically means one got out of lower school before the other. One of the biggest fops in British history. I wear a good pearl earring. I just can't afford one. He was a spy. He was one of the greatest playwrights in British history. Stabbed in a pub fight in Deptford, which people said was something to do with ex-lovers, but actually it was probably something to do with espionage. It might have been your Frenchies at work again, killing our spies. Stop it, you Frenchies. So it might have been all that, because I noticed there was a wonderful piece of research recently called Thinking Again, and I thought, oh, that's actually really convincing. But his version of Faustus, I mean, I find that chilling. The only person that Faustus manages to hurt is himself. And he can't see it. He can't see it all the way through, even when Mephistopheles, that awful name, the lover of lies, even when Mephistopheles is telling him some home truths to his face, he still can't work out that it's him that's causing all the damage. I find that much more convincing for the moral predicament, and particularly maybe for our own 21st century moral predicament. Is it just me? I'm getting more and more depressed over all of these political circuses and the complete lack of a middle ground nowadays, where people won't even talk. There's so much more to Western civilization than point scoring. No matter how angry and aggrieved people feel, there's so much more to it than that. The fact we can't talk anymore, I think, is probably the end. So I'm going to buy a turban, start reading the Quran, and hope for the best. Handing back to you, John, on that inflammatory comment.
Well, yeah, Christopher Marlowe. What a colorful character. Yeah, stabbed in a pub. What a way to go out. And you're probably right. It was probably some kind of political intrigue that led to his demise. It's hard to say at this distance. But yeah, there's that whole dilemma. And part of the thing with Faust in Goethe's portrayal, and remember, I made the point on a previous episode, the first part he wrote as a young man. And it was really only to the promptings of Schiller that he ended up, toward the end of his life, writing the second part. And Rudolf Steiner says it's very important to consider the difference in the consciousness of the young man writing the first part and the elder statesman writing the second part. Add to that the complexity that Goethe refers to when he says, "Two souls, alas, dwell within my breast." So you see that you have that unbelievably aspirational aspect of Goethe, and if you do any studies of the biography of Goethe, I mean, the poet Novalis referred to Goethe as Klingsor, right? He called him Klingsor because, in a way, you could see that. I mean, I had a book on Goethe years ago. I have no idea where it went, but it was called Goethe's Women Friends, and it was all the various liaisons that he'd had, and even the mother of his children. Uh, he didn't marry her until some years after uh, the son was born, which at that time would have been, you know, geez, I mean, we're talking about gossip, major gossip, and when you think of that, and then people, that there's been books written about people's theories about why he did that. Is that, well, she was at a lower station in life, and so it would, and then later in life he didn't care, and he ended up marrying her to give his offspring a name and all of that. But it could be that he was just he enjoyed the company of women, and this is where he ended up. It's very possible that the simplest answer is the best one. But that being said, Rudolf Steiner makes that point. He says you have this individual that can artistically represent some of the highest aspirations of the human soul. But yet, when you dig into his biography, depending on which aspect you look into, I mean, he was a stodgy bureaucrat, right? In the court of the Duchy of Weimar, and it's like he had to make decisions regarding who went to the scaffold, for example. Who got hung for a crime. There's so many different aspects to his personality that anybody could dwell on any particular one and come to a strong conclusion. It's similar in a sense to King James the First, because you have this guy, and Rudolf Steiner also talks about him as being this kind of uh, conundrum, and that you have uh, people say all these bad things about him, and many of which are true, he says. But then people say these good things about them, and yet those are true too. And so you have a man of tremendous contradictions, and so that is really something that characterizes the era in which we're living. It's possible to have both things going on at the same time, and that's the struggle in which we live. The difficulty being that those shadowy aspects are seeping up unconsciously, because the area of soul that in earlier epochs was a source of illumination, with the darkening of consciousness into a more material frame of reference, that now these forces work unconsciously. And so you see that there's a shifting, whereas the Luciferic forces worked within us in the inward sense more strongly in earlier epochs, with Ahriman outside of us, the spirit of materialism. As we crossed 1879, the war in heaven, there was a shift to where now that Ahrimanic spirit of materialism is working within, and the Luciferic more externally. So you see that there's a shift of dynamic there. And so it's up to us to be able to overcome these principles, because Ahriman wants to control everybody. And we see plenty of that going on in the current world today, because you can see that a lot of these people Seems their career path is controlling other people. That's their career path. Whereas Lucifer, he's indifferent. He could care less. Who cares about those people? Whatever. And he sounds like that one Rothschild that said that to that movie director. He said, "What do you care about those people for? Just take care of your family." It's like that aloofness that is often to be found amongst the elites. In the same token, the other side is their minister, who I'm in control now. Oh boy. And so that's the struggle that we're living in right now. We're watching it play out before us, that the elites that are indifferent to the needs and wishes of the common people are just seeking power. So you see them, they're incarnating both levels of aberration. And it's disturbing, but we get to see it in Technicolor. It's never been more clear than since the beginning of the 20th century leading up until now, that there's this whole drama being portrayed for us, and we're having the opportunity to see if we're going to be able to develop a voice of conscience and to come from the voice of conscience. Because if you remember, in Parsifal, one of the central riddles of Parsifal is that in order for him to return to the castle of the Grail, because he was turned away, because remember, he didn't ask, what ails you of the Grail King, his uncle, right? He's like, because he was so captivated by the Grail Castle. So he's swept away from the castle of the Grail because he didn't show concern. So that was that Luciferic challenge right there. And then ultimately, toward the end of the story, he can only return to the Grail Kingdom by taking someone with him. So it's that concern for the other. That's the central motif of overcoming the challenges that are struggling within the consciousness soul, because it's through our relationship to other. Because remember, Jesus Christ said, whenever two or more are gathered in my name, I am in the midst of them. So there's this whole concept of the other. And there's that dilemma of this duality of soul, and coming to meet a balance and find that balance through taking interest in the other and not wishing to control them, not wishing to dominate them like Ahriman, and not to be indifferent like Lucifer, but to take a genuine concern, because as it says in the Gospel of John, God is love.
Oh, you caught me there. You've got me worried now. Does every Brit, including me, go into some sort of weird semi-conscious reverie the minute the Queen's mentioned? I suspect I'm one of the least guilty of that. For one simple reason, I think the Queen Mother was probably the last real queen, if not the penultimate sovereign of this country. One of the reasons, before we get to the Queen Mother, the present Queen is holding on with white knuckles, is because terrible people like me will end up saying, "Why do we need a monarchy? Why do we need a monarchy?" the minute she lets go. I noticed Charles has already circumvented most of the humour that was coming in his direction. We were all hoping he was going to call himself Charles III. He wouldn't have lasted a week, I'm sorry. The gags would have been endless. But I notice now he's choosing a different name, Wise. But I mean, why do we need a queen? Maybe this one's the last one. And yeah, she's a pro. She knows how to turn up to supermarkets on time. shake the right hands, then sod off. I mean, that's really, really good. You need a pro. I rather like the idea of a depoliticized or apolitical head of state. I like the idea of a sort of a living embodiment of the Constitution, but that needs working at, and it shouldn't really be in the hands of a multi-billionairess who also has so much power and influence. No, 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 no. You know, that all of that can't fit together. Excuse me, but in terms of real monarchy, I might have said this before. I was saying it on some show recently. You know, the last one was the Queen Mother. If something upset her, she went to bed for a week, and it didn't matter what the Prime Minister said. You know, I'm the Queen. You know, go away. You know, going and pulling pints in local pubs during World War II. You know, so she could meet ordinary people and still be the Queen. You know, and also, I mean, the most gay-friendly monarch in this country's history. Have I told you this one, John? I can't remember. I mean, I used to know loads of people that worked at Clarence House. She preferred LGBT staff to every other type of staff because of their sensibilities. And there were two stories I remember to this day. I mean, she used to hit the gin quite a lot. She was the Merry Queen in the sense, Merry, of course, used to mean holy. So Merry Old England would have meant Holy England or Blessed England at one point. That wasn't the way she was using it. You know? Every time she was on one of the royal trains, she was hitting the bottle until it was approaching a station. Then she used to turn round to the staff and say teacups, I think. So she was knocking it back in the teacups and waving to everybody as she was going through. I think that's great. You need someone being a bit lively in that position. Or, of course, the other one, I may have said it, I can't remember. Please forgive me, everybody, if I have. You know, there were two queens having a row as they would take it. The rota got muddled, taking up the royal breakfast to the top of Clarence House. You know, I'm sorry, it's my turn. Well, if you look at the rota, you know, and apparently she came storming out from the top of the staircase in a hairnet, shouting, "There's one queen that wants her breakfast." You know, I mean, that's a monarch. That's a monarch. Never at a loss. Always knowing the right thing to say, the right thing to do. That's a monarch. Oh no, it's my sort of endless Hegelian need to resolve things and everything else, I suppose. Oh yeah, I'm into Hegelian mysticism as much as I am anthroposophy. I'm not sure they're entirely separate or they're entirely distinct from each other. All the points you said, I think, about Lucifer and Ahriman are absolutely taken. I don't know. I just think maybe the vocation of a Christian, no matter what epoch, no matter what time they're in, is possibly the same, at the risk of being deeply misunderstood, the same crusade, the same battle, in different shapes and forms. And yes, I absolutely no doubt that someone of Steiner's immense intelligence and gifts, who was looking at these other worlds and these other modalities and these other ways of experiencing what we are as human beings, absolutely no doubt of any of it. Though again, rather like Goethe, I'm not sure I understand all of it because it is just so refined and so detailed. Excuse me, yada yada yada. It just makes me think, yes, but surely the same pilgrimage is the same pilgrimage to the base of the cross for all of us at every time, in every place, in every culture, if you are following the ultimate path. For me, ultimately, this is where nobody invites me on their shows anymore. To me, ultimately, there isn't a choice. You know, Christianity is the ultimate pilgrimage. And no matter how glorious all of the others are, and they're glorious, they're beautiful, they're profound. But unless you've walked to the base of the cross of Christ Jesus, there is still something missing and still something not entirely in place. So for me, I suppose that's always on my mind when it comes to these types of conversations and all these wonderful esoteric tomes, and which we all need to read a lot more of, and we all need to familiarise ourselves with. Curiously, I got a message from David Conway, a chum of mine today, who's, God, how old is he now? David, if you hear this, you must be bloody 300. Right? I can't remember how old he is now. He lives in Wales. David Conway's not his real name. Ha ha ha! And I'm saying no more. The real name of the esotericist in question, who had a very good career, I think it was in the Foreign Office. Anyway, when I read his book on, what was it, occult wisdom, I can't remember the title, because he's just brought it out again. He's just reprinted it. And I was reading, because he's heavily into Steiner and anthroposophy. And as you know, I'm won back. I'm completely won over again by it all. Oh gosh, hang on, what was it? I completely won over. I've got it. There we are. Secret Wisdom. That's the old version. That's the old version. And he was an MEP. He met an MEP at one point, so he was involved in European politics too. But all these wonderful gifts and wonderful abilities and magic and miracles, and all of it's necessary and human and gorgeous and vital to our constitution. But are we still at the base of the cross of Christ Jesus asking for redemption? For me, ultimately, it always comes down to that. And I don't know, I'm just rambling. Now, I'll hand back to you, John, because I'm rambling. Because at the end of the day, what else would a minister say? Anyway, handing back.
Well, how does the song go? Life is like a rambling rose. The more you pick it, the more it grows. And that's a little tune from my youth, I remember. The MC5 did a nice version. But yeah, it's a fascinating thing when you realize that when you're faced with somebody like a Goethe or a Swedenborg, of which you're somewhat of an expert, being as you wrote a book about them, and so I find it interesting when people like who's normally a very intelligent person like John Rappaport, just a blanket attacks occultism. That's like attacking a typewriter for the words that have been typed on it. To me, because occultism is a really the science of things that are not visible to the physical senses. So I guess so is he declaring himself a neo-Kantian or and I think it's more the fact that he's an abstract thinkian. And he's talking again like your reviewer there. He's speaking out of class. He's talking about things that he obviously doesn't really know anything about. And Rudolf Steiner used to be confronted with that because he would on occasion make comments about people that had reviewed books of his that it was obvious they hadn't even read them. It's like they based their review on the title of the book. And I've never seen a critical review of Rudolf Steiner's work by anybody that showed any measure of comprehension. It's as if somebody tries to approach his works with just the abstract, normal thinking that most people manage to get through life with. You're never going to get through a Steiner book. You have to develop something inside of you that's capable of holding the thoughts. So that consequently, reading Rudolf Steiner himself is a path, because you have to develop yourself. You have to develop spiritual capacities to be able to hold the concepts that he makes reference to, because they're not going to be presented to you as a nuts and bolts thing of your physical sense perception. When you start getting into the realms of the supersensible, it becomes a question of nuance and all of that. And that's why the art is higher than philosophy. It really is. And in light of that, we could say Rudolf Steiner made a comment regarding the Renaissance, for example. He said the Renaissance was a period set aside for the spreading of Christianity through art. And so you have Michelangelo, Raphael, Da Vinci, all these amazing characters creating this art, because you have to keep in mind that it was against the law to, first of all, to even read the Bible, right? You were supposed to go to church and they were going to tell you what you needed to know. So that when people would come to the church and be confronted with the artistic creations of these great individuals, it's hard for us to comprehend how moved they became in the apprehension and the looking at these works of art of such profound beauty and strength and wisdom. And so it's that transformative aspect of art that is perhaps its most salient point. And it's like one of my teachers, Werner Glass, who was one of the direct students of Walter Johannes Stein, the great Grail researcher. Werner told me about how he, when he was living in England, he had taken on such a heavy workload that he was just becoming exhausted, and he went to see an anthroposophical doctor. And the doctor recommended that he go to the museum and spend a half an hour to an hour a day looking at the watercolors of Turner. And so he did that, and he found he was able to increase his workload so that there was a certain intangible nourishment that he was able to receive from the artistic works of Turner, and which I can understand. I remember one time I went to the Detroit Art Institute, and I was just looking at they have an amazing collection, first of all, that was built by the Fords and the Dodges and all these big industrialists. So it's a formidable collection, most of which now is in storage, I guess, and being mismanaged. But nonetheless, I was walking through looking at all these amazing works, and they have something from pretty much everybody of note. And all of a sudden, I came in front of a small self-portrait of Vincent van Gogh. And it was absolutely astounding that it was as if the thing glowed. And so you see a good example of what we're talking about, the two souls dwelling within my breast. Because in Van Gogh, we got this aspect of him that's something cosmic going on there, and yet, but the guy is such a tortured soul that he literally cuts off his own ear. So there's this duality that he's struggling with in his soul nature that's extremely profound, and so we always have to have a measure of reserve in attempting to pass judgment on other people, because we don't know what they're going through. We don't know what their personal biography is, let alone their biography from previous incarnations, the baggage that they're carrying with them. And so I try, if brought under criticism, to find something funny about it, so that I can laugh at myself, because I find that that's probably the most therapeutic approach I can come up with, and then think about it later. Fortunately, I have the capacity in pausing before I react to most things, so I don't have I don't have a hairpin trigger on my temper most of the time. But David, I feel for you. You know, it's unfortunate that this guy's piling on, but who knows? In any event, you are getting the word out about your conference, and I'm sure it's going to be very interesting. And why don't you bill it as an artistic event rather than a hard science event? Because it's very difficult to approach a subject like that from any vantage point, but a measure of artistry. And so that being said, if anybody feels they want to buy us a cup of coffee for all this jabberwock that we're going through here, you can send me a cup of coffee at paypal.me/John Barnwell 888, or you can send David a cup of coffee or tea. He is a Brit at paypal.me/dperry777, just like it says on the screen. Those two handles will work on our paypal.me/John Barnwell 888 or dperry777. And I still don't know what the he, him, his means, but that's okay. There's a lot of things I don't know, and I like it that way. What a friend of mine used to say, and that works for me. In any event, we're kind of moving along here. Is there anything we didn't get to that's burning in your chest?
Well, no, I confess I'm distracted by that review and that reviewer. I confess that today. I suppose for me it is an art event, but we can't bill it as that for the simple reason, I mean, that there'd be a great scholar there, Vladimir Wiedemann, who's an old friend of mine, an Estonian who's written 20 books, none of which, to my knowledge, is actually available in English, sadly. I mean, he grew up in the old Soviet Union. Estonians didn't take well to the Soviet Union. So he was a free spirit from the word go. I mean, he was a Soviet hippie. You know nothing about Soviet history if you don't think that was a radical move. That was a radical move. And certainly the film Soviet Hippies, which was recently made and is doing the rounds at the moment, is based on his book, Soviet Hippies. One of the most interesting stories, as an aside from him, was that they had Michael Tam, Michael Tam, who lived near their village stroke market town, who was one of the original missionaries for Vedanta in the West. And he was under house arrest for donkey's years by the Soviet authorities, who didn't know quite what was wrong, but it was subversive somewhere or other. So, I mean, and I remember Vladimir, who was, of course, was a major interpreter for the BBC for years, a respected writer. When he was a young devil-may-care hippie, they all used to go and visit the incarcerated Michael Tam. And I remember Vladimir saying to me, it was like visiting a wizard in this wooden house in the middle of a forest, So he's quite an amazing guy. I mean, certainly a scholar. I mean, the scholarly aspect of the conference, and as I say, it's a fundraiser. So what I didn't want for this year, it will turn into an annual event. What I didn't want for this year is talking heads staring each other out. I didn't think that was good for a fundraiser. Which maybe for next year, but not for this year. But Vladimir was actually in Moscow when the new anthropology, so-called, was running around Moscow academies. And the reason it didn't come to the West, apart from the Iron Curtain back in those days, was the fact that things were being to thaw internally across the USSR, and everybody was denouncing everybody else. Now, that's funny for us, but it wasn't funny for them. So it never really managed to come across here. So one of the ideas behind this conference, I mean, the idea started in 2014, when it was going to be much more razzmatazz, and much more show than I wanted, than it is at the minute. I'd have preferred the show version of it. It was called something like Nephilim, Crystal Skulls, Bloodlines, UFOs, and Uncle Tom Cobley and all. And we were going to have blood tests in the intermissions. You too might be a Nephilim. We're going to do everything. It was actually the Reverend Jim Wilhelmsen, who the reviewer doesn't seem to know is actually a friend of mine. Ha ha ha. Who said something quite cryptic. They don't like being talked about. Be careful. And bloody 2 weeks later, the thing had collapsed. So the whole event went, and it's taken me this long to bring it back. And as I say, they're doing their best to make sure it doesn't happen again, because it's going to be online as opposed to a real-time event. It's still based around Vladimir's experience of the new anthropology as it was being discussed by the scientific elite in the USSR of that particular time. And this is my humble attempt to introduce some of those thoughts into sort of discussion over here. I mean, if Vladimir wants to go further with that, then I think he'll need another vehicle, because that won't be what we're doing. But certainly it needs to be aired and it needs to be discussed. So there is a scholarly element. Somebody said the other day it was a psychic fest, which is a bit unfair. Yes, my dear friend Alan Cox is a well-known psychic and psychic healer, spiritual healer. I mean, Susan Laban, who has that sort of background as well. I mean, people are tending to underplay quite wrongly the fact she's actually finishing her PhD at a very respected Welsh university and going and arguing with people in Oxford every month, which I think is a very good thing to do. So, you know, from my perspective, what I want out of it, what I'm doing is art, and to an extent showmanship. I confess there's a Barnum in me somewhere. There's a sort of Dickie Attenborough, you know, you've never seen anything like it in your life. I confess, I love the highbrow stuff, but that is an element in me too, and I'm proud of it. You know, if I could find a push me, pull you, I would be sporting it around every pub in London and getting people to pay. Yeah, look, it's got two heads, right? So I would be doing that as well. But there is because that's the theatre side of it. There is, I mean, so there is a scholarly element, but there is a psychic element. Ra Castaldo, as I say, I think he's a very underrated young commentator. And we've got our dear friend Leo, of course, who'll be making a numinous visit to the conference from airwaves elsewhere. So, you know, it will be multifaceted this year as we find our feet, and maybe it will take a couple of configurations. If I have my way, it will turn into a more phenomenological event over the next couple of years, and we'll be looking at everything. But we seem to have struck a chord with the Nephilim. Excuse me. I have that down personally as a biblical mystery. I'd like to know what rabbis say about it. I'd like to know what Christian mystics say about it. It's not something I feel on safe ground at all about, but I know what Swedenborg said. I know what the poets and some of the mystics said, so I'm sort of coming from that background, and I'm quite happy with that. You know, I suppose with what's the best way of putting it? I'm more like Bodhidharma myself, you know, but I love Mahayana. I'm the Zen boy that loves Mahayana. I don't want to do it, but I love the smells and the bells and the show, and I love, you know, the endless files of monks and all the colours. Isn't that wonderful? It's just I don't happen to think you get that Zen moment easily from all of that. So that's my attitude to the conference, and largely my attitude to a lot of the psychic things we discussed, with the exception, of course, of Goethe and Steiner, who I can't put my finger on, but I'm looking forward to getting back into the Steiner debate and the Steiner family. You have me down as anthroposophist with a capital A, and I'm looking forward to my rebirth in that particular sphere. I'll hand back to you, John.
Well, that was refreshing. So we got Oklahoma and Missouri checked in. That's good. So what is your I wonder what your Estonian friend thinks about the Neanderthal genes that have worked into the human genome. That's probably one thing he may touch upon. Go ahead.
I've got to say something. One of the funniest things that ever happened in the past, I held this conference, oh God, in a place called the Chartered Institute of Arbitrators. I can't remember, it was so long ago, I can't remember quite what the theme was, but everybody's jaw hit the ground when he started going on and on about genetics. And did we all know that Adolf Hitler was a 0.0 African? Everybody's jaw. hit the ground, and someone in the audience said, "Are you saying he's black?" And then this row broke out in the audience, and poor Vladimir, the sort of scholar, not quite sure what he had unleashed, was just stood staring at the front, not sure what to say. Sorry for interrupting, John, but I knew you'd love that story. I'm handing back again.
Well, you know, travel isn't a new concept. And in the ancient world, people travel a lot more than people realize. And you'll find people quite surprised when they get their DNA analyzed. But nonetheless, you have to keep in mind that this DNA thing, personally, I think they're just harvesting for their own records. And I know of numerous people that have sent in different samples to different companies and got completely different profiles. So it becomes a question of, are they just like taking the money and just kicking out information? Because how are you going to know? And so I don't know. I never did it, but I think it's a fascinating concept. But I don't know about the strictures involved with the various companies and all of that. Some of it, I think, it'd be very easy for it to be a very questionable endeavor. But that being said, well, we're getting near the end of our little journey here, and this was kind of one of the more unusual episodes in our continual prelude to something that we're not quite sure what it is. But we know that at some point our question will get better. Well, we always like to put a punctuation mark at the end and let David, after he makes his reverie, to bring us into a prayer so that we can consecrate this event. And so, if you could, David.
Right, one thing, because you know me, it was actually an event called the London All thing. Secondly, yes, I confess to being the wild card today because I'm bloody annoyed over that review. So it keeps coming into my head. So my apologies to you, John, and my apologies to our listeners. But I hope we've all had some fun along the way. We started this show asking what is truth, like Pontius Pilate. Unlike Pontius Pilate, we've stood the ground together and are continuing to explore what the answer may be. On our journeys in the days and the weeks and the months ahead, no matter what is thrown at us, let's remember that truth with a capital T is in our hearts and in our minds and in every moment of love, every embrace, every kiss, and every single action that makes us human. And some people think that makes us more than human, that allows us to touch the Christ Spirit itself. On that note, be blessed in this week ahead, and may the light of truth continue our discussions, illuminating our discussions in the weeks ahead, and be with us this day and always. Amen.
Amen. Well, thank you so much.